Chapter 1. Friday, June 26, Sup/Sup, 1852. We are moving again today after staying over for a full day due to the rainstorm and mud. I hope we won't have many more unplanned stops. I feel like we're losing the advantage we have by leaving before anyone else did. Today is George's first day driving again after almost drowning to save my Anna. I still feel like I owe him so much. Losing my husband was bad enough, but losing my little girl would have cut my heart right out of my chest. All 3 Bedwell men will be sharing our meals with us, and I hope my children get to the point where they don't run away from George when he talks to them. The man is harsh, but he treats my children the same as he treats his own. I've found his boys like to hide when he speaks to them as well. George simply doesn't seem to know how to talk to people. He's gruff to the point of rudeness, but I have no problem standing up to him. Perhaps that's why he seems to respect me more than others. I have no idea. I do know that I yearn for a way to repay his kindness. There must be a way. Now that the day's walk was over, Katie waited as Stanley unhitched the team of oxen and put them into pasture with the others. There was always a small area where the oxen were kept when they stopped, and this stop was no different. Men took turns guarding the livestock, and others would guard the people. There was no true danger from the Indians, from what Katie had heard, but there was worry they would steal the animals. Katie squatted beside the fire she'd started with the buffalo chips the children had brought to her. There was an ingenious way to find the chips. Each child carried a long stick, and they would poke the stick into a buffalo mess. If the stick came out clean, it was safe to collect. If it didn't, no one wanted it in camp. She was always pleased to think that the manure left by their cows, horses, and oxen would later be fuel for another family along the trail. As she started supper for her own 4 children as well as George and his 2 boys, her mind was still on her husband. He'd been buried right on the trail, so other wagons would drive over it and his scent wouldn't be there when wolves came sniffing around. But to just leave him, if it hadn't been for her children, she would have crawled right into the grave with her dear Ned. Supper was a simple pot of beans with chunks of bacon cut up in them. And she'd make a sweet cornbread to go with it. The children wouldn't be thrilled with the meal, but their bellies would be full, and they'd be nourished. That's all Katie worried about. Anna came to her putting a small pile of buffalo chips beside her. "Is that enough, Mama? May I play with my friends now?" Katie smiled at the little girl she'd almost lost. It was hard now to look at her and not see her in the water, struggling to keep her head above it. She was so grateful to still have the child. This journey had been full of so much death and despair, but she couldn't turn back. She had to get the land Ned had wanted so she and her children could live a good life. "Of course, you may play with your friends now. Have Mrs. Pruitt send you back at supper time?" "Yes, Mama." And little Anna was off to play with Amanda and Sally, and all the other children who had started to gather around their wagon when they were in camp. George joined her looking a bit gray. Perhaps the doctor had been wrong, and he'd gone back to driving too soon. "Are you feeling all right?" George took a seat on a rock beside the fire. "I'm very tired, and I'll probably turn in shortly after supper." He shook his head. "Something I could do just weeks ago is much too difficult now. I feel like half a man." "Do you think you're driving too soon?" she asked. "I can get the doctor." He grunted. "I don't need a doctor. I just need to sit a spell." "Stop treating me like one of your children, Katie." Katie smiled at that. "I can't. I've spent so much time taking care of you that I can't help but worry about you." "Well, I don't need to be taken care of now." He looked annoyed with her, but Katie didn't mind. He was always annoyed with someone. He looked at the pot. "Beans for supper? Have I told you how sick I am of beans?" She shrugged. They keep better than anything else. If you want to eat, then we'll eat the beans we brought with us, and be thankful that God has provided." Smiling a little, Katie tilted her head to one side. Imagine how the Israelites felt when they were lost in the wilderness, with nothing but manna to eat. "I make beans less than half the time, and I feel very thankful." George sighed. "I should have known you'd use my complaints as a lesson in how to be a Christian." "You are a good woman, Katie." "I try to be." Katie stood up and stretched. There was only one more day of walking before their day of rest, and despite having a day of rest yesterday, she just needed another soon. She couldn't voice it though, because George liked to latch onto anything negative and make it a million times worse. "Where are your boys?" He shrugged. "They took their rifles and went off in search of game. They're tired of eating so many beans as well, despite the fact that we get a change from our version of manna on occasion." She smiled. "I'll tell you what. You boys get me some meat, and I'll make us a nice stew, or a roast if there's a lot of it. I would love to be able to cook more creatively, but at the moment, I have to ration our meat, so we're going to eat the beans we have, and thank God for every bite." George sighed. "So, what you're saying is I need to do my part and get out there and shoot a buffalo?" Katie shook her head. "Not at all. What I'm saying is if we get meat, we'll be thankful, but if we keep eating our beans, we'll be thankful for those as well." His boys and her son Stanley walked back into camp then. "3 rabbits," George's 15-year-old son, Harvey said. "Can we have them for supper tomorrow instead of beans?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Get them skinned and cleaned, and I'll happily turn them into the best stew you ever tasted." Katie was used to cooking creatively. Ned had worked for a factory back in Pennsylvania, and there had never been enough money to buy what they wanted, so she had learned to cook just about anything, including the squirrels Stanley would bring her for their meals. The boys grinned. "We'll have them back in a few minutes, Ma." Stanley led the other boys away, obviously thinking they'd find a stream or something. "There's no water along here." George called after them. "You boys need to use the sense God gave a goose." Katie frowned at George before smiling at the boys. "Use as little of our water stores as you can. We can't refill for a day or two." Stanley nodded. "Yes, Ma." Harvey looked between his father and Katie. "We'll use our water stores, since yours are used for cooking and dishes, Mrs. Gilbert." She smiled. "Good thinking, Harvey." "Thank you." As the boys hurried away, she looked at her daughter's savior and wanted to throttle him. "You don't have to yell at the boys constantly, you know. You could easily have told them to use water stores without insulting them." George sighed. "Patience never complained about how I talked to my boys. Patience was afraid of you. Everyone in camp says she was." "I'm not." "You're not to be rude to my children again." "I don't think you should be rude to yours either, but I can't control how you treat your own sons." She stood up, wishing she knew how to get through to him. Walking to the back of the wagon, she pulled out what she needed to make the cornbread for supper. She'd have to make a double batch because of their company, but George was sharing his food storage with her as well. "My boys don't mind how I talk to them." Katie shook her head. "When you were sick, they'd hide from you, rather than coming around. I was the only one who could stand being around you." "That can't be true." "My boys respect me." "Your boys fear you." "That fear is the only reason they obey. There's not one lick of respect for you at all." Putting the mixed cornbread onto the fire, she smiled. "There. Everything will be ready soon, and we can all eat." "Katie, why do you tell me all about my failings instead of being afraid of me like everyone else in this camp? Sometimes I wish you'd keep your thoughts to yourself." George was used to fear, and he preferred it because people were less likely to insult him. Katie shrugged. Someone needs to tell you like it is. If no one else will, I'll be here, ready to tell you all sorts of things you'd rather not listen to. George got to his feet. Sometimes you make me crazy. Sometimes I want to throw rocks at your head, Katie responded. She would never back down from the man. She'd seen how he treated women who did, and she wasn't about to be one of them. That's not very kind. I try to be a good Christian woman, but there are times, I think you were put on this earth to test me. She wiped her hands dry, and moved to the back of the wagon again, pulling out the dishes they'd eat with. The boys all stayed away until Katie raised her arm to get their attention and bring them back to her fire. Anna was the first to come back. She was afraid of the former captain, but she knew he'd saved her life, so she had a lot more patience with him than the rest of them did. Did you make your delicious cornbread to go with the yucky beans, Mama? Katie smiled at her daughter. Of course, I did. I wouldn't ask you to eat yucky beans unless you could sop them up with delicious cornbread. At Anna's toothless grin, Katie laughed. She couldn't help herself. Her daughter simply looked funny without her 4 front teeth. All her boys had lost their bottom teeth and then months later their top teeth. Not Anna. She'd lost all 4 in the same week. You fill me with joy, Anna, joy. It's my job, Anna said. You gave me joy for my name. The 5 boys trickled into camp then. Stanley, Philip, who was 9, and Gregory, who was 11, all belonged to Katie. Harvey, who was 15, and Albert, who was 12, belonged to George and his late wife. Stanley, would you say the prayer over our meal? Katie asked her son. She knew George and his boys didn't often make it to the church service in camp, and she could only imagine the type of prayer George would come up with. Sure, Ma. Stanley bowed his head and prayed for all of them. Thank you for this meal. We appreciate that we have beans to eat when there's little fresh meat. You always provide. In your son Jesus' name. Amen. Katie smiled at her eldest son. That was a fine prayer. And then she was busy dishing out beans and cornbread to all the children and George, and lastly to herself. While they ate, her children complimented her on the meal, all of them mentioning the cornbread in particular. The first time she'd cooked for George's boys, they'd complained, but they'd learned from her own children. This is really good, Mrs. Gabriel, Harvey said. Thank you, Harvey. Albert nodded. So much better than when Pa tried to make beans for us. They got burned, and we had to eat them or go hungry. George glared at his son, who immediately ducked his head. Sorry, Pa. You know better than to insult me in public. Albert nodded, refusing to look up. I'm very sorry. Katie watched it and shook her head. When we first started on the trail, I needed to learn to cook some things all over again. I was used to cooking on our stove in Pennsylvania, and it was difficult to learn to cook over an open fire. Stanley nodded. I remember you made some of your cornbread that even the dog wouldn't try. You brought a dog? George asked, obviously distracted by her admission she'd had to learn to cook all over again. Katie nodded. She was old, and we knew she wouldn't make it, but we brought her with us anyway. We thought she deserved to be with the people she loved in her last days. She died before we even reached independence. She missed the dog with everything inside her. She'd gotten Pepper as a puppy when she was first married. Anna sighed, patting her mother's arm. I miss her too, Mama. She was a good dog, Gregory agreed. As she finished eating, Katie walked to the fire where she'd already started water heating to wash the dishes. It was much less water than she would have liked to use, but it would be at least another day before they reached water, and she wasn't going to waste what they did have. Instead, she'd be thankful they had some and use the water as sparingly as she could. Anna walked around and gathered the dishes the boys had used and took them to her mother, but she left George with his bowl, which wasn't empty yet. Katie knew he was trying to get out of eating the beans, but she also knew he needed the nourishment that came from eating it all. "I'd like to see you finish it, George," she said softly. He grunted but ate another bite of the beans. "I'm looking forward to that rabbit for tomorrow." Katie smiled. "I am as well. I think I'll cut it up and make a nice thick stew out of it." Stanley sighed. "I cannot wait. Ma makes the best rabbit stew in all of the West. You boys go. Maybe you can kill a couple of more rabbits before bed. Come back as soon as it starts getting dark." All 5 of the boys stood and hurried away, grabbing rifles, and in Philip's case a slingshot. Katie knew from experience he would find rocks along the way. As soon as the dishes were finished and stashed in the back of the wagon, Anna looked at her mother, who nodded at her. Anna knew that meant she would be able to run and enjoy her evening until bedtime. She'd done her chores for the day. George looked around him at how quickly the camp had emptied. "How do you get my boys to obey you so well?" he asked. He'd always fought with his boys and had to resort to threats. "They respect me. And they know I'm cooking for them. None of them are going to risk not having food to eat. I do hope they can get 2 or 3 more rabbits, though. I think we could all eat our fill if they manage more." Katie smiled, thinking about how nice it would be to have a full belly for a change. She often didn't eat as much as she gave her children. "Would you like to walk with me?" George asked her. He'd seen so many courting couples walk together in the evenings. Perhaps she would allow him to court her. It was what he wanted. Katie was special, and she could talk back to him without being afraid. For so long, Patience had kept her head down, afraid to even meet his eyes. It had gotten to the point where he had little respect for her. Katie nodded. "I think that would be good for you. You need to keep your exercises up so you can regain your strength." George walked away from the center of camp, not reaching out to touch her, because that would be improper. He did carry his rifle over one shoulder, praying he could get one of the rabbits, or perhaps even a deer. "Everyone in camp blames me for my wife's death," he said softly, surprising her. Katie had heard the stories, but never from him. "What happened?" "Patience wasn't a strong woman," George said softly. "She begged me for years not to force her to go west with me. I made the journey once without her, and then I decided we were all going, whether she liked it or not. I know most women go west only because their husbands force them. It hadn't been the case with her and Ned. She'd readily agreed to go, knowing it would help him to live out his lifelong dream of having a ranch. He'd never liked the factory work he was forced to do to feed his family. Patience was ill a lot. She kept losing babies, and I thought it was simply because she was babied back home. She had a maid who did for the family, so she didn't need to." He shook his head. "So, I made her leave behind everything and everyone she'd ever known. She cried something fierce, but I wouldn't even let her bring the maid along." "Was she really too weak?" Katie asked, feeling badly for the other woman. "She was, but I didn't believe it. We hadn't been on the road long when I told her she wasn't going to spend any more afternoons sleeping in the wagon. I thought it would be good for her to get to know some of the other women." He frowned. "Instead, she stepped on a rattler, and she was killed almost instantly." Katie put her hand on his arm in commiseration. "I'm so sorry for your loss." He looked at her again, thinking for the 3rd time in as many hours about what a good woman she was. He didn't deserve to have her as a friend. Chapter 2. Saturday, June 27, Sup/Sup, 1852. We were able to move faster than expected today, and at the end of our journey for the week, we found ourselves passing through 3 crossings. It's where we crossed 3 rivers in the matter of a few miles. The captains made a smart decision to camp right after the 3rd crossing. At one point, the wall of granite beside us pressed so close there was only room for one wagon at a time. Soon after we stopped, many of the members of the wagon train ventured over to carve their names in the granite wall, just as they did at Independence Rock. How many places do emigrants' names need to be carved on a 2,000-mile journey? It seems to me they waste their time and effort forever carving their names. What they should be doing is hunting and making sure there's food for their families. I do not understand wasting time the way many of our company do. I myself would have taken the company through the South Pass. Yes, it's mainly sand, but it's a bit faster and would have been the best choice for us. I suppose the new captains are frightened enough of going without water. They do whatever they can to appease their sniveling women. George climbed down from his wagon, and Harvey rushed over to take care of the oxen. George was thankful his wife had insisted they wait a year before heading west, because his boys were big enough and strong enough to be of some real help. As he watched Harvey walk away from him, he realized his son was becoming a man right before his eyes. It was hard for George to think about. Walking straight to Katie's wagon seemed to be the right thing to do. He knew she was unsure of him in many ways, but he also knew he was determined to marry her and make her his. He walked to the fire she'd already started. He was always amazed at how very efficient the woman was with everything she did. She was a marvel in so many ways. He'd rarely admired a woman before, but this one, well, she was different. She took her tasks as seriously as any man he'd ever known, and she was so brave in the face of spending the rest of her life with no man at her side and being left with 4 children to care for. Katie smiled at him, and it was as if a second sun had come up in the sky to truly light the world. I'm making the rabbit stew. With the 7 rabbits the boys got yesterday, I should be able to make it very hearty. Stew sounds wonderful. Of course, you can even make the dreaded beans taste decent. Katie seemed surprised at the compliment. Why, thank you, George. The children came then, bringing their daily allotment of buffalo chips so they could use them for the fire. May we play now? Philip asked. At Katie's nod, he grabbed his slingshot, and all the children scattered. Katie sometimes missed talking to her own children when George was around, because they certainly wouldn't stay with her if he was there. You should make them do more, George admonished. Your girl is big enough to be helping you with the cooking. Katie smiled. Anna helps with the dishes every evening, and she gathers buffalo chips to burn. I won't ask more from her when she has such good friends she can play with in the evenings. She couldn't help but wonder why George wouldn't take a moment to learn her children's names, but he never had. His disdain for most women and children was obvious. At times she wanted to tell him that he couldn't eat with her family because of how he acted, but so far, a word from her had him acting civil. You spoil them all, Katie. Mark my words, they're going to have a hard time doing the work you need them to do once we actually reach our new homesteads. Katie shrugged. I'll retrain them then. The trail is hard on everyone, even the children. He watched her as she peeled and cut up carrots, potatoes, and chopped up the rabbits for her stew. That's going to be a big pot of food. She smiled, and again, he felt as if the entire world was brighter. We'll have enough for all of us to eat our fill tonight, and again at noontime tomorrow. I feel so thankful the boys were blessed with these rabbits, and in turn, we will be blessed with full bellies for a change. He shrugged. I sure had my fill of the beans last night. Katie laughed at that. We've all had a lifetime worth of beans, but tonight, we'll be able to eat a meal we actually enjoy and get our fill. That will be amazing for us. George shook his head. Is there anything you won't find a bright side to? She pursed her lips. To be honest, when I was sure Ned would die, I couldn't see any brightness at all. There I was alone in the middle of the prairie with my children and no one else around. I couldn't even legally live there, but I was going to try. I had to have a roof over my children's heads and food in their bellies. I would have done anything to make it happen, but I felt like I was plodding alone in the dark. He frowned. I'm so sorry, it's hard on you. Losing patience made me feel guilty for not listening to her that she needed to ride that afternoon, and I miss her, but I never felt like I was lost without her. Then you didn't truly love her, Katie said, stopping peeling a potato for a moment and staring into the fire. She felt badly for Patience that she'd never been loved, but even worse for George, because with the way he talked, she doubted he would ever find the kind of love she'd shared with Ned. She couldn't imagine a woman putting up with him and the way he treated others. As soon as everyone was gathered for supper, Katie's Philip said the prayer for their meal, and they all ate their fill. We haven't been able to eat this much ever, Anna said excitedly. Katie laughed. They had always had plenty as long as she'd been able to get a good kitchen garden going. There were of course times when food was scarcer, but she doubted Anna really remembered them. The boys did a good job getting enough rabbits for us to have a hearty meal, for a change. I'll gladly help with the dishes if you keep making food like this, Mama. You always help with the dishes with a smile on your face, Anna. You're a good helper. Anna seemed to grow 5 inches with the compliment. George stared at the child. He wondered if something like that would work for him. You're really good at collecting buffalo chips for the fires as well. The entire group went silent, and everyone was glancing at one another as if to see what was wrong. Finally, Anna gave him a leery smile. Thank you, Mr. Bedwell. George couldn't help but wonder why they'd reacted so differently to the compliments from him than they had from Katie. They took Katie's words for granted, but his? It seemed as if he frightened them all. After supper, Anna helped with the dishes, as usual. When she ran off to play, George asked about the reaction. Why did everyone seem almost frightened when I complimented Anna? They seem to expect it from you, but never from me. That's the thing, George. The children do expect compliments from me. They receive them often. Your words are more scathing. You teach the boys, but you do it through fear and not through love. He bristled. Are you saying I don't love my boys? Of course not. I would never say that. You simply don't show them love. A man doesn't need to show his love to his boys. He teaches through strength. Ned was always telling the boys he loved them and was proud of them. When Stanley started driving after Ned's accident, Ned made sure to tell him constantly how proud he was, and that he'd be a good provider if Ned died. Stanley didn't want to see his pa die any more than I did, but he seemed to understand that he was capable, thanks to Ned's words. Treating a boy like that makes him a Nancy boy. Katie sighed. No, it doesn't. It makes him strong because he knows he's loved. My boys know I love them. She shook her head. No, they know you will take care of them. They're 2 very different things. And your way of parenting is better than mine, I guess? George felt the anger rising up inside him, but he knew he couldn't let it show. Katie was the only woman he'd ever met who would stand up to him, and if he tried to show her his anger, she would simply refuse to listen. He couldn't help but admire her, even as he felt anger toward her. I honestly don't know which is better, but I know what I want for my children. I want them to feel as if I'll love them no matter what happens to them. I want them to know I'm here for them. My boys know that. Do they? George glared at her for a moment. The dancing is about to start. Let's go join the others. Katie looked at him with surprise. You never join the others for dancing. I will tonight unless that bothers you as well. George didn't like her criticism of him, but he realized that his boys probably didn't like to be criticized either. Maybe it was time to learn more from her. As they walked to the area where the dancing would take place, Katie watched George as he avoided talking to anyone else. The other women came to her and talked and laughed with her. Betty was the only bold one who looked at the former captain and smiled. "You seem to be feeling much better, Mr. Bedwell." George simply nodded. "Thanks to the expert care of Mrs. Gabriel, I believe I am." Katie realized then that she was the only person she'd ever heard George compliment until supper that evening. Maybe the man was softening. He needed to if he didn't want to spend the rest of his life alone. Once they were sitting on the ground, no previous groups had built benches there, he turned to her. "I don't think I'll be able to dance this evening, but I thought perhaps we could enjoy watching the others." "I appreciate that. I do enjoy watching the children dance. That Edna girl in particular." George made a face. "I don't believe I would have allowed her family to come if I'd realized how simple she was." Katie shook her head. "I don't think she's simple. I think she enjoys life to the fullest, and she's not afraid to say what she thinks. I find her very endearing." "I'm not so sure," George said, shaking his head. She couldn't help but smile at that. "I am." The music was lively, and she enjoyed watching the children dance. One of the Cauldron twins took Anna's hand and led her to the makeshift dance floor. Though Katie was wary of the boys, she thought it was sweet when he bowed low to Anna, and she curtsied. Katie watched them closely, but the children seemed to simply enjoy the dance. She spotted little Amanda bawling with the boy's twin. She hadn't yet learned to tell them apart, but they weren't completely identical. She'd have to ask Mrs. Cauldron for advice on telling the differences between them later. She leaned toward George and said softly, "I will let Anna choose her own husband, as long as it's not one of the Cauldron twins. Those boys are hellions." George chuckled. "You never know. One of them might grow up to be a preacher." Katie shook her head. She believed a child could be anything, but a Cauldron boy becoming a preacher? That would be like asking the earth to open up and rivers to flow in every direction. It was impossible to even consider. Not those boys. After the dancing had stopped, Katie gathered her children. "Let's get back to our fire and get ready for bed. Tomorrow is our day of rest, which means I will spend it working in camp." She didn't mind having to do the laundry on Sundays as long as they didn't have to walk. She didn't know why one felt like it was all right and the other didn't, but it's how she'd felt since they'd first left. Of course, her last company had planned to move every day to beat the snows. She knew it was important to not get caught in the storms, but it was more important to worship her God. Back in camp, Anna sat down with Katie. "Is Mr. Bedwell going to be our new pa?" Katie's eyes grew wide. "No, sweetie. Of course not. I'm only watching out for him because he saved you from the river." Anna nodded, but Stanley walked up behind them. "I'm not sure, Ma. I've seen him watching you when you're not looking. I think perhaps he's thinking of you in a way you don't think of him." Katie shook her head. "I don't think so. He's not a man to look at any woman as if she's special. I think he is. I heard all the stories about him killing his wife and all that, but Harvey and Albert say that he loves you like he never loved their ma. And how would it make you feel if I did marry him then?" There was no way she would ever do it, but it was interesting to hear her children's view on the subject. Stanley shrugged. "He's really different than Pa, but he seems to be getting better. He doesn't yell at us anymore, and he's yelling at his own sons less. Maybe you're teaching him how to love people and not yell like he used to." "I'm not so sure about that." Katie was surprised to hear what Stanley was saying, but when she thought about it, he did seem to have softened around his children and hers. Did that mean he was actually changing? Or was he simply trying to be nice because she'd nursed him for so long? Maybe there was hope for George Bedwell yet, but not with her. No, he couldn't marry a woman with children. He still had trouble figuring out how he should treat them. As the children went to bed, she thought about her duties for the next day. She needed to make supper, and hopefully someone would get some meat, so it could be a fresh meat supper, make breakfast, and she could serve the leftovers from supper for the noon meal. Then she had to do the wash for the week down at the stream with the other woman, and make sure everything in the wagon was tidy. She needed to go through George's supplies as well to see if she could supplement her flour and sugar with what he had left. Worrying about the food she had left wouldn't help. They'd purchased enough for a family of 6, and without Ned, they should have more than enough to make it to Oregon. If they were able to get some buffalo, then she and the other ladies would spend the day together, smoking and drying the meat. But oh, a couple of fresh meals would feel heavenly. Perhaps it was possible, but she could never count on the luck that it took to bring the meat in. No, she'd planned to make beans after they had 2 hearty meals of rabbit stew, and they could complain all they wanted. Beans were filling, and if the children didn't go hungry, that was the most important thing to her. Then, as she did at the end of every day, she had a little talk with Ned. Some said that your loved ones watched over you after they passed on, and she wasn't sure she believed it, but it did make her feel better to talk to her dead husband. "I miss you so much, Ned. The children are asking if I'll marry again, and even suggesting the man I told you about, George Bedwell. Remember, he's the one who saved our Anna from drowning in the river. I thought he was a horrible man, but the children have pointed out that spending time with me has made him softer. It's strange to think about, and I'm still not sure I believe it, but they don't sound like they'd be opposed. Don't worry, though. You are my one true love, and if I did something like that, it would only be to help the children. I worry that once we reach Oregon, I won't be able to provide for them. I suppose I could offer to cook meals to travelers, but I want to follow your dream and start the ranch you always wanted. I don't see why I can't. Stanley really thinks he could run the ranch, and the other boys are willing to help. Anna says she'll do all the chores. We both know our Anna doesn't know how to do all the chores, and she wouldn't if she did. The girl is still flighty, but I do love having a girl finally. She helps with the dishes every night without complaining, and she has even gotten good at finding the buffalo chips for my fire. All the children have surprised me, growing up so much since you passed on. It sure does help, but I wish my babies wouldn't grow up so fast. They're all I have left of you, Ned. I wish I could just have one more kiss. One more embrace. I never dreamed what life would be like without you, and I know it couldn't have been as bleak as reality has been. But as you asked, I keep smiling for the children. It does grow a little easier every day, but nighttime is hard for me. I want to feel your loving arms around me, and feel you press a kiss onto my cheek as I fall asleep with you holding me. Life will never be the same without you, but you had a dream, and I will do all I can to make that dream come true. Good night, Ned. I will never stop loving you." Chapter 3. Sunday, June 28, Sup/Sup, 1852. I'm so thankful that today is our day of rest. When Ned first wanted to go on the trail, I was worried about all the extra work I would face, but then I gradually became excited to start a new life with him, ranching like he has always wanted. After he died, I went back to thinking about all the extra work involved with the trail. The children help as much as they can, both with hunting and helping around the camp. I do wish Anna was a little older and could help more, but I also don't want to wish away her wonder at everything around us. She is my last child, and thinking about her growing up leaves my heart sad. We had a delicious supper of rabbit stew last night that was more than enough for our family as well as the Bedwells. I do hope that we can get more fresh meat today. The men have all gone to hunt this afternoon, while we women stay in camp and see to chores that must be done, such as laundry. The boys are willing to jump in the creek here with their clothing on, and they say they will get just as clean, but I don't believe them one bit. Instead, I'll wash their clothes for them. The habits my boys have picked up on this trail are truly appalling, and I know it will be all I can do to retrain them to be gentlemen once we reach Oregon City. My family has been asked by the others in camp to settle with them, and we can continue to help one another the way we have done on the trail. As long as the rest of us arrive in one piece, I will settle anywhere. Thankfully, we are over halfway now, and the children are all well. I pray every day the Lord will keep them safe for the rest of our journey. Now, I must do the laundry, and I will say an extra prayer that the men get fresh meat. I can make do with the jerky we have, but it is so nice when we actually have something fresh to eat. Katie carried the dirty clothes she and her children had worn that week down to the creek, thankful there was a place to wash. They hadn't expected to go quite as far as they had the previous day, and they were all delighted to be able to refill their water barrels and have a place to wash their clothes. She knelt at the side of the creek beside Mrs. Davies, who seemed to be handling the loss of her husband as well as anyone. Katie understood the look on the other woman's face, and she just wanted to gather her into her arms and hold her, telling her everything would be all right. But they both knew that wasn't true. "What can I do to help you?" Katie asked, looking at the other woman. Mrs. Davies's eyes filled with tears. "There's nothing anyone can do. I still can't believe my poor Adam was trampled by the very buffalo he was trying to kill for our supper." She dashed the tears away with the back of her arm, her hands covered with soap and water from her own laundry. "I understand. My Ned was lost in just a couple of days. We were certain we would be alone on the prairie for the rest of our days. I'm glad the captains didn't feel the need to leave me behind. I don't know what I would do." Mrs. Davies rested her hand on her abdomen. "I was waiting for our next meal with fresh meat to tell him I was expecting. He died without knowing." Katie's heart went out to the girl beside her. "I'm sure he knows. If you find you need help with anything, you let me know. The trail is hard on all women, but if you are in the family way, I can only imagine it will be so much worse. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make your days easier." "Thank you," Mrs. Davies said, trying to smile, but it looked like a mockery of happiness more than anything else. "How are you handling driving your wagon while pregnant? The last couple of days must have been particularly hard on you." Mrs. Davies nodded. "I never liked driving even when I wasn't expecting. But now? It feels like my arms are going to fall off, and I'm so tired." She shook her head. "Never in my life have I wanted to nap as badly as I have the past couple of weeks." Katie frowned. "I may have a way I can help. Let me talk to some people, and I'll let you know later. And I'd love for you to join us at our campfire for supper tonight. You shouldn't have to cook after doing laundry all day." Mrs. Davies smiled slightly. "That would actually be really nice if you don't mind. I'll warn you now, the former captain eats with my family every evening. I hope you won't mind. I think I can handle that. All three of us have lost loved ones on the trail, after all." Katie wasn't certain that George had lost someone he loved. It sounded to her as if Patience was just a woman he took for granted, though she hoped that wasn't true. Everyone deserved love. "I usually stand with my hand up to call everyone to supper. I'm certain you'll see it. Thank you again for inviting me. I didn't even make it to our church service today because I didn't want to see or talk to anyone. I appreciate your kindness." Mrs. Davies rinsed out her husband's extra pair of pants. "I don't even know what I'm going to do with these, but I'm keeping them. Someone will need breeches, and I can provide a pair." Katie smiled at that. "I still have my husband's spare clothes as well. I can't imagine getting rid of them. Though I've heard we can trade with the Indians at Fort Bridger." She finished scrubbing Anna's spare dress. She'd brought 2 changes of clothes for everyone. "I'm Katie, by the way." "I'm Jane. May I use your Christian name?" Katie asked. She knew not many of the women had gotten close to the new widow. "Absolutely. And I'll use yours." Katie smiled at the other woman. I'll be watching out for you as I can. Jane sniffled a little. I need it. I wish I could turn right around and go back to Wisconsin and my mother, but I feel we've gone a little far for that. I wanted to do the same thing when Ned died. The memories don't fade, but it is a little easier to smile as I think about him every day. We're here to help with anything you need. Thank you. Jane finished the last of her laundry, and Katie watched her head back to her wagon. Wanting to treat her new friend as Margaret had treated her when her Ned had just died, she would be watching out as much as she could for ways to help. Even if she couldn't do something, she could easily ask someone else to help Jane. After finishing up her laundry, Katie walked back to her wagon. It wasn't late enough to start supper, and she had her work for the day finished. She longed for a nap, but she would feel guilty for taking it. Hopefully, the men would be back soon with meat, and she would be needed to help with the drying of the meat. Sitting down outside her wagon, she picked up her Bible and read some of Proverbs, her favorite book. It always made her feel like her mother was whispering in her ear as she read the words of advice, probably because her mother had constantly quoted from Proverbs. Her mother hadn't been able to read, but she'd attended church every Sunday, and she'd memorized all the scriptures she could. As soon as the thought crossed her mind, she decided she would spend the few minutes of free time to write to her parents. Her sister lived close enough that she would read the letter to them. She knew her mother would want to hear the news of Ned passing, and they would be able to mail the letter from Fort Bridger when they arrived. Just as she took out her ink and quill, she saw some of the men come back into camp, dragging a buffalo. She had no idea who had shot the huge beast, but she knew she would be involved in drying the meat. None of the women could do it alone, not even Mary, who seemed to be able to do everything better than anyone else could. To her surprise, the buffalo was dragged to her fire. Mr. Bedwell shot this one. He's resting on a rock on his way back, but he'll be here soon enough. He made sure we knew to bring it to you, Mr. Pruitt, Margaret's husband, told her. Katie covered her mouth with her hand. She would definitely share the meat, because others shared with her, but her family would get first pick of the fresh meat. Other women were gathering beside her wagon to help her get the drying done. It wasn't an easy task, and it would take them a good long while. Margaret stood beside her. This is your first, isn't it? Katie nodded, feeling so much like crying it was ridiculous. This felt like God had reached down and given her a gift that she so desperately needed to have the confidence to keep going. We'd better get started. She said a silent prayer of thanks for the meat, and then she and the other women began the task before them. Everyone who helped would walk away with a portion of the meat in payment. Katie noticed that Jane wasn't there helping, and when she looked around, she saw the other woman asleep under her wagon. She told herself she'd put aside a bit of the meat for her as well. Losing her husband in the first months of pregnancy had to be harder than what Katie had gone through. It would bring a lesser woman to her knees. Because it was Katie's buffalo, the other women looked to her for direction. She took a huge roast from the beast, planning to cook it for supper, and use what was left for stew the following night. 3 nights in a row with filling meals would help her family's morale a great deal. The women worked until the buffalo had been portioned out and strips of it cut up to dry before moving on to Betty's campsite to work on the buffalo one of the young couples on the trail had shot to pay the doctor for helping the wife with childbirth. Katie went along and helped with the slicing of the meat, listening to the doctor argue with Mr. Smith. I know you think you owe me, but I don't take a turn with guard duty, so me helping everyone I can is my paying people back for guarding me. Mr. Smith shook his head. No, because you've helped my wife and I both when we were sick. Thank you for helping us, and now I no longer feel I owe you a debt. We got a good buffalo last week, and I'd be pleased with a couple of steaks for my wife to cook, but the rest is yours to do with as you will. The doctor sighed. All right. You'll get your steaks, and we'll call ourselves even. Betty hadn't waited for the argument to be over, and all the women were already working on the massive buffalo. "Thank you, doctor. I mean that. I'd do anything to make your life easier." By the time the second buffalo was distributed and sliced to dry, it was time for Katie to start supper. Her arms ached from the work involved with drying the meat, but she would never complain. Her mother had told her that a complaining woman wasn't thankful for the blessings in her life. She was determined to always be thankful. As soon as they were finished with the drying, Katie went back to her campfire and put her huge roast into her Dutch oven, adding in water, carrots, and potatoes. She wished she could make biscuits with it, because it would be tasty, but she knew enough to save the flour she had for nights when she needed to stretch their meals. When Anna hurried over to Katie to see what she was cooking, the girl squealed. "No beans." Anna held her skirt out to both sides and spun in a circle, singing "No beans. No beans. No beans," over and over. Katie simply laughed and shook her head at the girl's antics. Her heart went out to Jane then, because she had no children to help her learn to smile again. Katie had kept going for her children, and her forced smiles had turned into real ones. It wasn't that she didn't miss Ned every day of her life, but that she was forced to go on for her children. She hoped that Jane would be able to keep going for the baby she carried inside her. The captain got back to camp hours after the buffalo had arrived. Katie took one look at him and poured him a cold cup of coffee. "How are you feeling?" she asked. He shook his head. "I made myself keep up with the other men until I got my buffalo, but then I was too tired to do more." Katie patted his hand. "I'm sorry it was so difficult for you, but I thank you for the meat. I'll use it wisely." "Did you share with others?" he asked. He wasn't sure if he wanted her to have shared or not. It seemed that they should keep all they could for themselves, but he knew others had shared with her. Perhaps it was smart to make friends along the trail as she had. "Of course, I did. And I saved a bit extra for Jane Davies. She's the one whose husband was trampled a few days back, and she told me today she's expecting. She'll join us for supper tonight." The former captain nodded. "I can't imagine her having to drive those oxen when she's in the family way. About that, I was hoping you could spare Harvey to drive her team. I can see how hard this all is on her." Katie knew he wasn't prone to looking for ways to help others, but perhaps he would be willing to help if someone pointed out the situation to him. "I think that's a fine idea," he said, surprising himself. "Harvey is old enough to help in a lot of different ways. Will you invite her to supper every night?" She smiled. "I'd really like to if it's all right with you and the children. I don't know what would have happened to me if not for the kindness of others. Especially George, who had seen to it that she didn't lose a child along the way. I think it's a fine idea. I hope you kept a large roast from that buffalo before you gave it all away." Katie grinned. "I did. I kept a huge roast that will be enough for a roast and potatoes tonight and a stew tomorrow. Just think, we'll have 3 nights in a row with food that we like before we have to make do with beans again." George smiled and nodded. "I'd be thrilled not to eat beans for a month or 2. You know as well as I do that can't happen. We need to eat, and beans last longer than anything else." Katie smiled as Stanley and Gregory walked back into camp. "What are you boys up to?" "We were swimming in the creek. Philip and Mr. Bedwell's boys are still there. I'm sure they'll be back in a minute." Katie frowned. "I wish you boys hadn't left your brother in the creek." George spoke up then. "My boys are strong swimmers. Philip will be fine." "All right. I'll stop worrying then." It felt strange to Katie to trust George's sons to keep her safe, but there was no alternative unless she wanted to run down to the river herself. Besides, their children had all taken to looking out for one another. Chapter 4. Sunday, June 28, Sup/Sup, 1852. I don't know what it is about spending time with Katie Gabriel, but I find myself wanting to help others. It always takes me by surprise when I agree to do something nice for someone else when she asks. I guess what it really boils down to is I would do anything for Katie. Anything. I shot a buffalo today, and in my weakened condition, I couldn't even help bring the animal back to camp. Instead, I had to sit on a rock and rest while some of the younger men of the company brought it to Katie. I did make certain that it would go straight to Katie instead of to my camp. It felt good to be able to contribute a great beast like that to our food supply. Oh, like Katie always does, she shared it with the other families in camp, but even that didn't bother me. Do I wish she'd kept it for us to use? I'm not even certain. I'm glad we had a day of rest today, because I need it to get stronger. The meat should help me feel like I can do more as well. Life has taken some strange turns since I jumped in the river to help Anna Gabriel. The child is strong and healthy, and I will be again soon. I'm determined. Katie Gabriel is a good marriage prospect, and I'm going to make certain she's mine before another man catches her eye. There's just something about her that makes me want to be better. If I can be my best self with Katie around, then she needs to always be by my side. It's only logical. George sat on a rock at Katie's campfire and watched as she cooked their supper. The children were all off playing, but they would be back for supper soon. "Are you going to make biscuits to go with our meal?" he asked. Katie frowned. "I thought about it, because they would be delicious with the roast, but I'm certain I should save the flour for a time when there's no meat to be found." George frowned. "You know I have plenty of supplies, and we'll be in Fort Bridger within a week or two. We should be able to trade for more flour while we're there." She smiled at him. "You're just trying to make it okay for us to have a huge meal tonight." He laughed softly. "I think it would help me grow stronger. And think of all the boys. They'll be able to eat their fill. It's so rare right now that we're able to really eat. I think it would be wonderful if you made biscuits." Her face softened. "All right. I'll make biscuits." Katie wasn't certain what it was about the man. She'd seen him order everyone else in camp around many times, but he had only shown her kindness. Well, that wasn't completely true. When she'd first taken to being a nursemaid for him, he'd yelled at her repeatedly. Even before he'd been able to yell, his whispers had felt like yells. Maybe the man truly was changing. With the help of the Lord, perhaps he would continue to change. "Thank you. I won't pester you for dessert, but..." Katie pursed her lips. "Biscuits or dessert?" "Your choice." "I'll take the biscuits, but if you think about it, we're having a guest at our fire tonight, and it would be nice if we had a dessert as well to share with her. I'm certain she'll be happy enough that I'm cooking for her that she won't mind not having a dessert at all." Katie wasn't going to budge on her decision to make one or the other, no matter how much cajoling George did. George sighed, but he didn't seem to really mind. Instead, he watched her. She wasn't certain why he watched her so closely. She certainly wasn't a pretty young girl any longer. She'd married Ned when she was only 16, and she'd given birth to Stanley at 17. Turning 30 on her next birthday made her feel downright old. As she mixed up the ingredients for biscuits, she thought about Ned and how he would feel that she'd formed such a close friendship. She wasn't even certain friendship was the right word, with another man so soon after his death. She could only hope he'd be pleased that she'd found someone who would provide meat for her and the children. When the meal had finished cooking, she raised her right hand, and she could see little Anna rushing across the circle of wagons to her. She also caught Jane's eye, and the other women nodded, picking up her Dutch oven and carrying it toward Katie's fire. The boys came as well, and soon they were all gathered, simply waiting for Jane to finish her trek to them. She nudged Philip. "Run and carry that pot for Mrs. Davies." Philip was an obedient child and didn't have to be told twice. He ran toward the young woman and took the pot from her. Katie could hear his voice as he said, "Please allow me to carry this for you, Mrs. Davies." Jane nodded and smiled. "Thank you for your kindness." When they reached camp, Katie smiled. "Children, I'm not certain if you've met Mrs. Davies yet. Her husband died a few days ago, and she's going to be eating with us." George immediately said, "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Davies. It seems we've all lost our life partners on this trek." Mrs. Davies seemed startled by the kind words. "Thank you, Mr. Bedwell. Starting tomorrow, my older boy, Harvey, will drive your wagon for you," George said. "There's no need for you to do so much work in your condition. Walking with the other women is more than enough." "Thank you." Jane looked over at Katie. "You did say you might be able to help with the driving. I appreciate you arranging things for me." Katie smiled. "No woman should have to drive oxen 20 miles per day when she's expecting. George can drive again, and Harvey has experience." It was the first Harvey had heard of his new task, but he simply nodded his agreement. "I'll be happy to drive for you, Mrs. Davies." Katie realized that George's boys had become much kinder in the past couple of weeks as well. It was strange that it had only taken a kind influence in their lives for them to leave behind a lifetime of anger. Hopefully, it would continue that way. Jane smiled and nodded, and it looked as if the smile reached her eyes for the first time since Katie had begun talking to her at the creek that morning. It was good though. Learning to smile and laugh again had been the two hardest things for Katie after Ned had passed. George offered to bless their meal, much to Katie's amazement, and his prayer was a good one. She'd worried about letting George and his boys pray aloud for their meals because she hadn't known what would come out of their mouths, but now the worry was gone. She dished up food for everyone, adding 2 biscuits to each person's plate. When she handed Jane her plate, Jane said, "Thank you for the meal, Katie. I brought dessert for us all to share." Katie smiled, shaking her head. "I'm sure everyone will be very happy with that." George grinned at her, knowing she was thinking of the discussion they'd had just minutes before about having dessert and biscuits all in the same meal. If her mind was on him, George found he was happy. A plan was formulating in his mind to keep her with him forever. As they all ate the meal, Katie thanked George for shooting the buffalo for them. "It's so nice to have fresh meat for our supper." "Thank you, George." He nodded, but she could tell he was pleased with her recognizing his work. As soon as everyone had eaten their fill, Jane opened the Dutch oven she'd brought from her own wagon. "I made an apple cinnamon cake. It was my husband's favorite thing I cooked, and he'd ask me to make it every night." Her voice sounded far away as she spoke, but Katie understood. She was mourning her husband, even as she cooked his favorite cake. She wouldn't be able to do anything without thinking of her husband for a while, but gradually she'd learn to live her own life again. "Thank you for letting us try it. I'll have to get your recipe." Katie had never attempted an apple cinnamon cake. She made cobblers and pies, but not as many cakes as some women did. "I'll share my recipe for cobbler if you'd like." "I would adore that." "Thank you." Jane seemed like she'd come back from her short trip to visit her deceased husband. All of the children raved about the cake, the Bedwell boys taking their cue from her children. It seemed no one had attempted to teach the boys manners, but they were picking them up a little at a time. She was pleased that her children were able to teach the manners she'd ingrained in them to the Bedwells. Jane insisted on staying and helping Katie with the dishes. "But Anna helps with the dishes. You should go rest." "I cannot imagine being on the trail and expecting," Katie said. She really didn't think the other woman should have to help with the dishes for the large group of people she cooked for every night. Jane shook her head. "I will either help with the dishes, or I'll need to refuse any further invitations to eat with you." Katie sighed. All right. Anna, thank Mrs. Davies, and then you may go and find your friends. Anna smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Davies. Jane smiled at Anna. Thank you for letting me eat supper with you. You're welcome. Anna ran off then to play with her friends while the two women did the dishes. Katie washed and Jane wiped the dishes dry. I hope you'll eat supper with us every evening, Katie said. Stanley drives for me, so I'm perfectly capable of adding one more person, but I will probably need a bit of your food stores. I'd like that a lot. Thank you, Katie. What's one more when I already cook for a large group? Katie smiled at her new friend, thankful that she was accepting her offers of help. After the dishes were finished and stowed back in the wagon, Jane went back to her camp. Instead of walking, Katie sat down on one of the rocks beside the fire. All of the children had gone their separate ways, but George remained. I was thinking about something, George said softly. Oh? Katie's mind was on the following day when they would be back to walking their 20 miles per day. It wasn't yet the 4th of July, and they were well past the halfway mark. Unless there was an extremely early winter, they would be able to make it to their new homes before the snows, and that would make everything so much easier. I think we should get married, George said softly. Katie stared at him, wondering if somehow one of her children had talked to him about it. I'm not so sure. Is it my temper you're worried about? He asked. She nodded. I can't risk someone mistreating my children. Ned never yelled at them, and I don't think anyone should start yelling at them now. I can't risk that. It was hard to admit what the problem was, but she needed to be honest with him if they were discussing something as important as marriage. George sighed. What if I prove to you that I won't yell at the children? How could you prove that? If I make it until Friday without once yelling at the children, would that convince you? Make it 2 weeks, she said softly. She wanted to tell him that he had to not yell at them before they reached Oregon City, but she knew that would be asking too much to have him wait that long. She did wish she had someone to lean on who would help her make a living. He frowned. Let's say through Monday, and if I do well, we get married Tuesday after the wagons have stopped rolling for the day. Katie considered what he was asking. She couldn't imagine lying with a man other than her Ned. I wouldn't want to have marital relations for a while. I haven't stopped mourning my Ned. I agree. George wanted to say that he hadn't stopped mourning Patience, but he had to wonder if he'd ever truly mourned Patience. Yes, she was the mother of his children, but his father had told him to marry her when his friend, her father, had died, leaving her an orphan at 16. She simply wasn't bold enough to be married to a man like him, and he wasn't sure he'd ever felt love for her, or her for him. If you can make it to a week from tomorrow without yelling at my children or me, then I will marry you. Katie hoped she was doing the right thing by even considering marrying the man, but she had to do what was best for the children. I think we'd still need to keep both wagons. Even with our diminished food supply, there wouldn't be room for all the food we would need in just one. Katie nodded. We really should have brought 2 wagons for the amount of food we needed with the 4 children, but we didn't have the money for another wagon and 6 more oxen. I have my Bible and 1 book that Philip begged me to bring, but those are our only possessions we brought beyond what we needed for the trail. Her Philip loved to read, and she couldn't leave his book behind, even if it meant that she couldn't bring along many of the things she had. Other than the Bible, that was her most treasured possession, she didn't need anything else. Not even the cradle her husband had made for their babies to sleep in, though she'd wept over it as they sold it to a young couple expecting their first child. It had felt like she was losing a piece of herself. Her Bible was more important though. It had belonged to her father's grandmother, and their entire family was listed in it, generation after generation. There wasn't a keepsake more important to Katie. George nodded. 2 would have been good, but if you didn't bring many keepsakes, then it should have worked. She nodded. Ned was very careful about what we brought with us. Philip ran into camp then. Mama! Look what I found. He held up a book. It was just sitting there on a rock. May I keep it and take it to Oregon with us? Katie frowned. You know I told you only one book. You must decide if you want the new one, or the one you brought from home. Philip looked as if he'd cry for a moment, but he straightened his shoulders. I'll put my old book on the rock where I found this one, and perhaps another child will pick it up and they can put the book they have there. She loved the solution. I think that's a wonderful idea. Someone else would love to read your book. Philip threw his arms around her. Thank you, Mama. I can't wait to start reading. Promise me you won't read while we're walking again. She shook her head, looking at George. He tripped over a rock, and if it hadn't been for Stanley's quick thinking, we'd have lost him. He landed right next to a rattlesnake, but Stanley found a rock and bashed it over the head. George smiled at that. Stanley is an impressive young man. He could easily see that her Stanley at 13 could do anything his 15-year-old son, Harvey, could do. It was a testament to his parents that he was so able. George could see how her style of soft parenting had worked, and he was truly impressed by it. Katie smiled at him, one of her rare smiles that lit up her whole face and made him feel as if he was in the presence of the sun. Thank you. The compliment was for Stanley, of course, but she knew her son was the way he was because of her and Ned's teachings. Philip looked back and forth between the adults. I'm going to get my book and take it back to the rock, he said. That sounds like a good idea. I want you back in camp by sundown, so we can all sleep. Yes, Mama. He ran back toward the rock where he'd found the book, and Katie smiled. My mother couldn't read, but she made sure I could. I taught my 3 boys, and when we reach Oregon I'll work on teaching Anna. I hate that my mother couldn't even read the Bible and had to rely on my sisters and me. George shrugged. I never really thought a woman needed to know how to read. Patience could, and she spent all of her time reading, and left the maid to do the housework, cook, and take care of the boys. Katie frowned. I would never suggest a woman should read and not take care of her responsibilities. I read my Bible in the evenings, after all my chores are done. I know you would never shirk your duties, Katie. I've seen you do everything you could to care for me, while still feeding your children and mine. You are truly a remarkable woman. Thank you. Katie wasn't sure why his compliment made her feel so good about herself, but it did. Obviously, his wife hadn't been willing to do much outside of reading, and it made her understand his attitude about the mother of his boys so much better than anything else ever would. George got to his feet. Walking so much today has tired me out more than it should have. I'm going to head to bed. He was 10 feet out of camp before he turned back to Katie. Thank you for considering my offer. And then he was gone. Katie couldn't help but wonder if considering it was the right thing, because her children had to come first. No matter what. And having a father was the right thing for her babies. Chapter 5. Monday, June 29, Sup/Sup, 1852. To my surprise, George Bedwell, the man who saved Anna, has asked me to be his wife. I'm not sure I trust him because of his temper, but he promised me he is a changed man. If he hasn't yelled at anyone by a week from today, I will be forced to believe he can hold his temper in check, and I will marry him. If not, he will never be a father figure to my children. They are too precious to me. I've made friends with the most recent widow of the company. Her name is Jane Davies, and she'll be eating with us each evening. She is insisting on helping with the dishes, which I appreciate, but the woman is in the family way, and I'd rather she rests when she can. George's older boy, Harvey, will be driving her wagon from now on. I think that will remove at least part of her burden. It was bad enough for me when I lost my Ned, but I cannot imagine what it would be like if I'd been expecting this trail. I understand why Ned wanted us to move to the west. We stand to gain a great deal financially because of the free government land, but it is the most difficult thing I've ever done. I would rather go through childbirth than walk this trail, but walking is what I do every day. My children will benefit from it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't weigh heavily on me that they are in danger, as am I. We will be moving again today, and I'm pleased that Mrs. Davies will be walking along with the other women again. She had been married less than a month when she and her husband began this journey, and she kept to herself mostly. She and her husband spent every spare minute together, as newlyweds do, and she didn't take the time to get to know the other women, the people who can help her from here on out. The men don't think to look out for others. They simply make certain their families are safe. We women, we work hard to take care of each other. As the oxen were hitched to their respective wagons Monday morning, Katie found Jane and asked if she would like to walk with her. When the other woman agreed, Katie introduced her to the friends she'd made along the way: Hannah, Mary, Margaret, Betty, Penelope, and Trudy. All of the women were happy to accept her as their friend. The group tended to try to keep each other occupied as they walked, and there was much revelry and laughter as they plodded along toward the Elephant, Oregon. It seemed each day that they felt further and further away from their destination, but not one of them was willing to turn around and go back. They'd come too far. As they walked, Betty looked over at Katie. "I see that you're spending a lot of time with the former captain. Are you sure it's safe to have him around your children?" The look of concern on Betty's face was real, and Katie knew Betty had her own difficulties with George. Katie nodded. "He's different now. He's much calmer and doesn't yell nearly as much." She took a deep breath. "He asked me to marry him last night." She hadn't planned to tell anyone about the offer, but it felt right to get it out in the open. Betty gasped. "You're not considering it, are you?" Her eyes were wide, and it was obvious by her face that she had no hope for a marriage between the two of them. "I am. My children need a father, and he has been nothing but kind. Not for the past few days anyway. I will give him my answer in a week. He's given me some time to consider." Katie didn't want the other women to know the arrangement she'd made with George because she was certain they wouldn't understand. No one saw George quite the way she did. Besides, they didn't need to know she was asking him to prove he could hold his temper in check. Trudy shook her head. "Oh, Katie. I saw the way he talked to you when I sat with him while you went to church with the children. Even his boys were hiding from him." The pity in Trudy's eyes made Katie want to explain how different he was, but she had a feeling the other women wouldn't understand. Katie sighed. "I know. It's different now that he's not an invalid though. He thanks me for every meal, and believe it or not, his boys do as well. It's rather remarkable when you think about the manners they didn't display before. His boys have even taken my older two sons under their wings, and they help them learn to be better hunters. I appreciate all he and his boys have done for my family. And George risked his own life to save my Anna. How could I think poorly of them, knowing that?" Hannah nodded at Katie. "I understand. God is good, and if people make a real change, He forgives. We should forgive as well." Hannah, the pastor's wife, had changed a lot on the trail as well. Katie couldn't help but admire the other woman, though she was much younger than Katie. Margaret shrugged. "If you feel like he won't harm you or your children, and it seems like the right decision, you should marry him. Our opinions don't matter at all. Only yours." Katie smiled. "Thank you for saying that, Margaret. It felt good to know someone understood her. If anyone would, it would be Margaret, who had recently married for the second time. Her two girls were the most important thing to her, and Katie respected that. The three Henderson children walked past then. Their mother had been the first casualty of the journey, and their father drove all day. At first, they'd walked with Hannah and Mary, but now they tended to just plod along on their own every day. The oldest Henderson child, Natalie, smiled as they moved past the group of women. "Hello, Mrs. Scott." Hannah smiled. "How are you three today?" "We're good. I made supper last night and no one died from eating it." Natalie couldn't be older than 10, and Katie bit back the invitation to allow the other family to eat with them. She was already cooking for 9 people. It wouldn't be smart to add 4 more. "If you need help cooking, you can always ask me," Katie offered. "Thank you, Mrs. Gabriel. I might stop by sometime." Natalie didn't seem overly excited at the offer though. She looked at Katie's boot. "You need your boot fixed. You should talk to my pa. He's a cobbler." Katie hadn't realized they had a cobbler in their group. "I will do that." Her right foot had been hurting since a hole had developed in the side. She would be certain to go to Mr. Henderson the next time they were in camp for a while. It would be good to perhaps cook a meal and trade it for mending the boot she wore. It was her second pair of shoes she'd worn out on this walk. If he could fix just one of them, maybe she could save the third pair she'd brought for after their arrival in Oregon. Pa would just tell you he'd work in exchange. "Make us a meal, and he'll happily fix your boot. And then I won't have to cook for a night." Everyone would win. Katie laughed. "I'll be sure to do that." As the children walked away, the topic turned to the book Philip had found. On a rock beside the creek, Philip, my reader, found a book someone had left behind. I made him choose between the book he found and the one he'd brought with him, and he chose the new book. He left the other book on the same rock he'd found the new book on. I hope another child will find the book and enjoy it as much as Philip has. Betty, who read more books than anyone else, grinned. "I think that's wonderful. It's like there's a book exchange happening out here in the middle of nowhere. A book train, if you will." Katie nodded. You should have seen how excited Philip was to have a new book to read along the way. He's read the other one so many times, I think he's memorized it. She shook her head. "I'd complain about his reading all day if he didn't do the chores I give him and play with the other children some, but he does those things, so I'm just proud of him for reading." "Why wouldn't I be?" Jane stopped for a moment, her hand going to her abdomen. "I think the babe is moving," she said. "How far along do you think you are?" Margaret asked. "Maybe 8 weeks?" Jane said. "It's probably not the baby moving just yet," Katie said. "I had pains and strange sensations in my stomach the entire time I carried all 4 of mine." Margaret nodded. "Me too." Mary looked at Jane. "If you think there's a problem, I'll fetch my ma. She's a midwife." Mary had obviously seen enough trouble with pregnancy. She was immediately concerned. Jane shook her head. "I don't think that's necessary. I'm sure Margaret and Katie are right. The babe is just making its presence known. If it keeps up, you just let my ma know about it, and she'll know what to do." Katie smiled at her friend, who had begun walking again. "I'm making stew for supper tonight with the leftover from our buffalo roast yesterday." Jane smiled. "That sounds lovely." Her eyes were distant again, though, and Katie knew she was thinking of the husband she'd left behind. They'd buried him right on the trail for the rest of the company to roll over, so his dirt would be packed down, and he wouldn't be found by wolves, or grave robbed by Indians. "Don't feel like you always need to provide a dessert, though," Katie said. "I don't want my children to think a meal isn't complete without a sweet to finish it off." Mary shook her head. "I know my younger brothers and sisters think that. They're all spoiled though." Hannah smiled. "I wouldn't call your siblings spoiled. Hannah tried to never speak poorly of anyone. You don't know them like I do. When they stopped for their noon meal, Katie made certain to let Jane know she was invited to join them. It will just be some of last night's meal, but it was good the first time, so should be just as good the second. I don't think that's a good idea. I'll just eat some hardtack. My stomach doesn't want me to eat anything until supper time. Katie nodded, understanding. Get some rest while we are stopped then. No need for you to wear yourself out when you don't feel like you can eat anyway. She was glad Jane knew how to get around the queasiness already, and Katie said a silent prayer that Jane would know when it was important to talk to a midwife or doctor. When they'd stopped, Katie quickly got out their food from the night before, and she served it up onto everyone's plates. They only stopped for 2 hours for the noon meal, and it was good if everyone could sleep for an hour of that. There was no need to start a fire to warm up the food. They'd just eat it cold. While Katie prepared the meal for the two families, she was well aware of the other activity in the camp. The oxen were unhitched and allowed to rest. A fresh pair would be put on each wagon for the afternoon drive. Children gathered with their families, and older children helped with the livestock. When everyone was together at the back of her wagon, Philip said the prayer. She hadn't yet asked either of George's boys to pray, unsure what type of church upbringing they'd had. She would have to let one of them pray soon, though, so they wouldn't feel slighted. As they ate, they all talked about what they'd seen that day. There they were, between two major milestones of the trip. They had passed Independence Rock, where they'd carved their names, and they were yet to make it to Fort Bridger. Katie wanted to make sure her letter to her family was ready to mail before they reached Fort Bridger, but every time she put pen to paper, something happened that required her attention. They'd been in Oregon Territory for a while, but no one had seen the place they wanted to spend the rest of their lives. This area was flat with prairie grasses and no real trees. They wanted a place that had access to fresh water, and some trees would be nice. Trees were needed for building, though they'd certainly found a way around burning trees as firewood. When they'd first had to use buffalo manure to feed their fires, Katie had worried the smell would be overwhelming and the chips would burn too quickly. Instead, the fuel hadn't had a foul odor and the manure had burned as long as a log of wood. It was truly a wonderful alternative fuel. Stanley looked extremely tired to Katie, and she was suddenly worried that something had made him sick. "Are you feeling all right, Stanley?" she asked. Stanley nodded. "I didn't sleep well last night. I'm not sure why, but I'm awful tired today." Katie frowned, wishing she knew what to do. "I can drive this afternoon, and you can ride in the back of the wagon." She wasn't comfortable driving the oxen, but it didn't seem as if she had a choice. Her son's health was more important than her discomfort. George shook his head. "Albert will drive your wagon this afternoon. There's no need for you to drive." Katie bit her lip, hating the idea of taking even more help, but she realized that if their families were to merge into one, she would have to get used to relying on George and his sons. "I would appreciate that if you don't mind." She looked over at Stanley. "I want you to nap until we leave this afternoon. Perhaps you'll feel up to walking." Stanley nodded. "I'm sorry, Ma. I'm trying to do my share." He looked disappointed in himself, but she'd been worried about him for days. He was trying to do too much as the man of the family. "You've done more than your share since your pa fell sick. You deserve an afternoon of riding instead of walking." Stanley nodded, finishing the last 2 bites of his noon meal, and climbing under the wagon to sleep. Katie was pleased to see how quickly he'd obeyed, but she was still a bit worried about him. She'd leaned on him for a good long while, and he deserved rest. George frowned at Katie. "Do you think he's getting sick?" Katie shrugged. "Perhaps. I certainly hope not." She looked at her son, lying there looking so small under the wagon. "I know he hasn't had anything to drink except coffee." If he didn't sleep last night, then it makes sense that he's tired today. I suppose it does. Anna moved close to her mother and wrapped her arms around her. Will Stanley be all right? Of course, he will, Katie said, saying a silent prayer. She was right. She hadn't thought she'd lose Ned either, but losing Stanley as well? She was certain her heart would shatter into a million pieces, and there would be no reason for her to even try to continue on. Go and lie down in the back of the wagon. You need your sleep as well. Anna grumbled a little, claiming she was too old for naps, but then she spotted her brother and stopped immediately. Yes, Mama. Katie was aware of George's gaze on her, but she said nothing else as she sat there, engrossed in prayer until their noon break was over. Stanley slept in the back of the wagon until they reached their stopping point for the day, yet another campsite without fresh water. They'd all filled their barrels the night before, though, so it would all be fine. She made stew for supper that night, and Stanley ate more than his share. Katie felt better watching how strong his appetite was. Jane looked at Katie with a smile. He's got his appetite back. Katie nodded. Are you feeling better this evening, Stanley? Stanley nodded. I'm sorry if I worried you, Ma. I should have rested more yesterday. As long as you're all right, I have nothing to complain about. You do a man's work every day, and your pa would be so proud of you. Stanley's chest seemed to grow 3 inches at the compliment. I miss him every day. Katie nodded. I do too. After the supper dishes were washed by Jane and Anna, everyone went in their own direction. Katie invited Jane to stay at her campfire, but the other woman told her she was too tired. The fatigue on her face was clear. So, George and Katie sat together at the fire, listening to the sounds of the others in the camp around them. Are you still worried about Stanley? George finally asked. Katie sighed. I am. I can see he's doing better than he was earlier, but it's a mother's job to worry about her children. I take that job very seriously. George chuckled. I can ask the doctor to look at him if it would make you feel better. Not at all, Katie said. She knew there was no reason to bother the doctor except to make her feel better, and that's not why a doctor should look at a patient, for their mother to stop worrying. How was the drive for you today? You don't look as tired as you did on Saturday evening. I think it was easier today. Every day seems to get a little easier. I was sure I'd have to be left at the side of the trail with my boys going on without me, but thanks to you, that didn't have to happen. Have I told you how much I appreciate the way you took care of me? You mean you didn't mean it when you kept yelling at me when I made you eat when you didn't want to? She asked, smiling. You know I didn't. He shook his head. I don't know why my temper has always been so bad. But George did know. There was just no way he wanted to admit it to her. His father had been a drinker, and he'd been mean when he'd gotten into his cups. George had simply followed his father's example in marriage and parenting. He thought he was doing the best thing, but watching Katie had taught him better. Her children obeyed because they loved and respected her. It had nothing to do with fear. You're getting better, Katie told him. That's the important thing. I try every day. I've started praying when I wake up that I'll be able to keep my temper in check. I had some temper issues when I was a girl. My mother had me memorize Galatians 5 verses 22 to 23. Then when I started to get angry, she'd have me list the fruits of the Spirit in my head. It has always worked for me. I'll look that up, George said with a smile. I cannot imagine you losing your temper. I think you're the only person who has seen me lose it since I was 6 or 7. You made me want to throw rocks at your head, but I couldn't because you saved my little girl. I guess I wasn't a very good patient. She shrugged. Not particularly. I think anyone would have trouble being a patient under those circumstances though. Have I told you how very happy I am that you survived? No, but I'm glad. He got to his feet. I'm going to go turn in. The day starts earlier every day, it seems. Good night, George, she said softly. As she watched him go, she had a little talk with Ned in her mind. I miss you so much, but if George can keep his word and not yell at the children for a full week, I will marry him. He would be a good provider for me and our children. I don't believe I could ever love him as I love you, but he's a changed man from what I can see, and he deserves a chance at happiness. He's always been kind to me when he wasn't ill. Hopefully, that will continue. Please forgive me if I do marry so soon. It would make it so much easier to reach Oregon City. All of the weight would no longer be on my shoulders. She rubbed the back of her neck, wishing it was Ned's hands rubbing away the tension of the day. Good night, my love.